Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the 17th lecture of this massive open online course on Sociology of Development. As you know, we are in the 7th week of this lecture on 7th week of this course on Sociology of Development. It is on critiques of modernization theory. As you know, modernization theory postulates that the less developed economies would eventually catch up with the industrialized world, provided they emulated the economic and social systems of Western capitalism. As it is based on the theoretical premises of structural functionalism, which suggests that society is composed of complementarity and reciprocity of roles in the social division of labor. And then we have discussed theories of modernization and explicitly or implicitly theories of capitalist development, which is premised upon the creation and maintenance of institutions and structures of a capitalist economy. And then we have discussed how the modernization theory accorded central role to the state and its public policy, but failed to examine the nature of the state itself, its location within the matrix of a class divided society and its relationship with various other contending social forces. I mean, we have discussed Hamza Alawi's reflections on theories of modernization. Then we have discussed how if this is the case, then the state was thought within the purview of modernization theory as an entity that stands outside and above society. The state was also thought of as an autonomous agency which takes help from the metropolis, I mean takes help from the technical assistance, takes the help of technical assistance from the developed world. And the state was also thought of as having the capability to initiate and pursue the programs of development for the whole, for the benefit of the whole of society. Okay? And there is a problem, I mean then there is an implicit disjunction between the state and society, and that is how we have come to a point where we also have discussed Theodore Sanin's reflections on the relationship between class, state and revolution, and I mean through the empirical peasantry and the hypothetical proletariat. And in the last class we have discussed certain theoretical and methodological issues through the works of Alex Inkel's conceptual model of individual modernity, I mean the analytic model, the topical model and the behavioral model. Okay? When I said the analytic model, I mean modern individual. The topical model includes women's rights, birth control, religion, the aged, politics, information media, consumption, social stratification and psychic adjustment. And the behavioral model is basically a psychological model and so on. And today what we are going to do, we are going to foreground the critique of modernization theory in a more striking manner. Okay? When we say critique of modernization theory, I am going to depend on the works of Dean C. Tips, Modernization Theory and the Comparative Study of Society is a Critical Perspective. Tips recognizes that writers employing the concept of modernization have exerted an important influence in calling attention to the interconnections among the diverse strands that make up societal transformation. Tips nevertheless questions whether it is a scientific concept in the sense that it offers the most adequate set of categories for understanding change in modern times. While advocates of the concept of modernization will be inclined to take issue with a number of the positions, it also provides a very valuable critique that both probes some of the weaknesses in writing on this subject and provides a reasoned analysis of a wide range of critics. The use of the term modernization, if you look at in its present connotations, is more than 60-70 years old, becoming an accepted part of the vocabulary of American, and it has also become quite international in the 21st century in 2021, and despite its relatively rapid rise to currency, the popularity of the term does not appear to be matched by any widespread consensus concerning its precise meaning. The proliferation of alternative definitions has been such, in fact, that the ratio of those using the term to alternative definitions would appear to approach unity. The popularity of the notion of modernization must be sought not in its clarity and precision as a vehicle of scholarly communication, but rather in its ability to evoke vague and generalized images which serve to summarize all the various transformations of social life attendant upon the rise of industrialization and the nation state in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And these images have proven so powerful indeed that the existence of some phenomenon usefully termed modernization has gone virtually unchallenged. While individuals may differ on how precisely this phenomenon should be conceptualized, and a number of critics have addressed themselves to the relative merits of alternative conceptualizations, both critics and advocates alike tend to assume the basic utility of the idea of modernization itself, treating only the manner of its conceptualization as problematic. And in what follows in this lecture, that will be made to subject this assumption to a critical evaluation, critical examination. The function of scientific concepts, as Kaplan argues, is to mark the categories which will tell us more about our subject matter than any other categorical sets. The issue posed here is whether or not the notion of modernization is capable of performing this function. What sort of problems beset current versions of the concept? Can these problems best be resolved within the framework of yet another version of the modernization paradigm, or are they such that the entire idea of modernization should be discarded in favor of some alternative paradigm? And if we have to take a more radical option of rejecting the existing modernization paradigm in favor of an alternative paradigm, then are there alternative paradigms to the notion of modernization which do in fact promise to tell us more? The purpose of today's lecture is to address the first two of these questions. The discussion is divided into two parts. As a prefatory remark to the subsequent analysis, the first section of this lecture outlines some of the origins and characteristic features of modernization theory that I will do very briefly, and the core of the argument is presented in the second section in order to obtain an overview of some of the problems raised by current uses of the modernization theory. We will first start with the origins of modernization theory. The proximate origins of modernization theory may be traced to the response of American political elites and intellectuals to the international setting of the post Second World War era. In particular, the impact of the prominent the impact of the Cold War between the United States of America on the one hand and the Soviet Union on the other, and the simultaneous emergence of the less developed countries as prominent actors in world politics in the wake of the disintegration of the European colonial regimes. Empires converged during this period to channel for the first time really substantial intellectual interest and resources beyond the borders of American society and even of Europe into the study of the societies of Asia, Africa and Latin America. During the 1960s and 1970s, American social scientists and their graduate students, with the generous support of governmental and private agencies, turned increasing attention to the problems of economic development, political stability and the social and cultural change in these societies. A good portion of this attention was devoted to the elaboration of numerous conceptual schemes which in many respects served as surrogates for a tradition of inquiry into the problems of these societies, which was almost entirely lacking. Unable to rely for guidance in the design, execution and interpretation of their research upon a previously accumulated literature, it is hardly surprising that social scientists engaged in this task should turn for assistance to the familiar intellectual traditions of Western thinking about the nature of social change. The influence of such received traditions is particularly evident in the case of modernization theory. Though their terminology may be somewhat novel, the manner in which modernization theorists tend to approach the study of social change in non-Western societies, including India, is deeply rooted in the perspective of developmentalism, which was already firmly established in the conventional wisdom of Western social sciences well before the end of the 19th century. Indeed, Robert Nisbet in Social Change argued that this perspective, which may be traced to the idea that social change may be studied by analogy with the biological birth of individual organisms, that we have discussed in the third week of this course when we discussed classical sociology and the notions of social change, ideas of evolution and progress. It dominated Western thinking about social change from the pre-Socratics through 18th and 19th century theorists of progress and social evolution to contemporary social sciences. Within this tradition of thought, evolutionary theory and 20th century functionalism have been particularly influential in the shaping of modernization theory. Evidence of their influence may be found in many features of modernization theory, namely the frequent use of dichotomous type constructions, concepts such as social differentiation and social system, an emphasis upon the ability to adapt to gradual continual change as the normal condition of stability, the attribution of causal priority to immanent sources of change, and the analysis of social change as a directional process. These attributes of modernization theory are not simply remarkable parallels with earlier theories. Many of the leading contributions to modernization theory have come from like Lerner, Levy, Schwarz, Benjamin Schwarz, Eisenstadt, who have been schooled in functionalist theory and the intellectual milieu from which it emerged. Beyond the very general sorts of attributes, the task of identifying characteristic features of modernization theory is not an easy one. The heterogeneous meanings which have been attached to the concept of modernization embody a wide range of substantive interests, levels of abstraction and degrees of attentiveness to definitional problems. Still, since our purpose is not the piecemeal criticism of one or another version of modernization theory, but the evaluation of modernization theory, critique of modernization theory, examination of modernization theory itself is a theoretical orientation and or idea system, and effort in this direction is essential to establish some common ground which the critique may proceed. Two methodological similarities may be noted at the outset. The first is the search by modernization theorists for definitional inclusiveness. Modernization is generally taken to be, in the words of Samuel Huntington, a multifaceted process involving changes in all areas of human thought and activity. Accordingly, the concept tends to be a summarizing rather than a discriminating one, as every effort is made to specify its meaning in terms which are sufficiently general to avoid excluding any of the possible ramifications of the multifaceted process. Attempts at definition are aimed more at telling us what modernization is or might be than what it is not, or who carefully what it is not or what it might not be. The second methodological similarity concerns the question of units of analysis. Those studies of modernization have focused upon many different levels, ranging in scale from the individual through local communities to national and international units. It is the national territorial state which is of critical theoretical significance, even if this does remain largely implicit. It is here at the national level that the various facets of the modernization process has seen to be aggregated. However, it may be conceptualized whether as industrialization, economic growth, rationalization, structural differentiation, political development, social mobilization and or secularization or some other process. Each component of the process of modernization is viewed as representing a source of change operative at the national level, although it obviously may be studied at a variety of other levels as well, even in the case of someone as Inkel's, which we have discussed in the last class, who focuses upon individual responses to modernization in search of a cross-cultural personality syndrome of modernity. These responses are aggregated and compared at the level of national units. Thus, theories of modernization are fundamentally theories of the transformation of national states, which are implicitly taken to be coterminous with the boundaries of whole societies. There are of course other similarities which are really apparent among various conceptualizations of modernization as well. However, as might be suspected from the initial deliberations that we have made in this lecture, the greatest areas of agreement tend to be on those points which are most superficial. Thus, there is general agreement that whatever else it may be, modernization is a type of social change which is both transformational in its impact and progressive in its effects. It is also generally viewed as extensive in scope, as a multifaceted process which not only touches at one time or another virtually every institution of society, but does so in a manner such that transformations of one institutional sphere tend to produce complementary transformations in others, for a forceful statement asserting the systematic characterization of modernization. Beyond these generalities, the task of sorting out similarities and differences between alternative approaches, whether it is Latin American critique of development, Latin American critique of modernization paradigm in terms of dependency theory or Marxist theory of development. Okay. That is why I said the task of sorting out similarities and differences between alternative approaches becomes somewhat more difficult. Such is the variety of usages we generally find that they cannot be easily encompassed within the framework of a single classification. Okay. Individual approaches to the study of modernization have not escaped criticism. Unfortunately, however, such criticism has tended to be not only relatively frequent, but partial in scope, widely scattered and too often simply ignored. Still, these critics taken together constitute a useful starting point. When systematized and supplemented where necessary, they provide the basis for a more general and thoroughgoing critique of the theoretical orientation embodied by modernization theory. The task, so far as the critiques of modernization theory are concerned, is a twofold one. First, to codify the criticisms to which modernization theory is vulnerable. And second, to evaluate the implications of these criticisms for the future of modernization theory. To the extent that the criticisms levelled against modernization theory are valid, a choice must be made between two alternative courses to test the validity of the criticisms against modernization theory. On the one hand, modernization theory might be reformed. This would require the formulation of yet another version of modernization theory, though hopefully one better able to meet the various objections which have been raised against earlier versions. I mean, it is a more conservative approach. Okay. On the contrary, the idea of modernization may be rejected in its totality, in its entirety. The second radical option implies the need for the formulation of an alternative approach more suitably to the analysis of the sorts of problem which modernization theory is intended to address. While previous critics have been overwhelmingly revisionist, this one is revisionism, and this is radical. The second one is radical, the first one is revisionist. That is why I said while previous critics have been overwhelmingly revisionist on orientation, the purpose of this critique is to consider the future of modernization theory in the light of both of these two alternatives. Okay. Now if you look at this, in some contexts the concept of modernization is used primarily as a classificatory device, as when Levy, for example, distinguishes between relatively modernized and relatively non-modernized societies on the basis of the extent to which tools and inanimate sources of power are utilized. Look at relatively modernized and relatively non-modernized societies. How are we going to make a distinction between relatively modernized and relatively non-modernized societies according to Levy? No, on the basis of the extent to which tools and inanimate sources of power are utilized. I mean, machines, industrialization, and so on. Okay. For others, the concept identifies a peculiar and open-ended type of social change, as when the historian Benjamin Squarge, for example, draws upon Max Weber to define modernization in terms of the expansion of individuals' rational control over their physical and social environment. Okay? This is very important. Okay? When I say that individuals' rational control over their physical and social environment, I mean how individuals not only contemplate on nature, not only worship nature, but also know how to master over nature, how to control over nature. That is why there is a shift from faculty of contemplation to faculty of control, okay, when we look at the relationship between individual and nature. Okay. Yet another orientation to the definition of modernization views it not as a type of change, okay, but rather a response to change. Okay. As in definitions such as that of Halpern, which stress the capacity of institutions to adapt to or control rapid and continuous change. Distinctions between usages such as these are often tenuous, however, particularly since alternative orientations are often combined within a single definition. Thus, Eisenstadt, for example, argues that modernization is characterized by two features. One, a type of change. Okay. When I say a type of change, it refers to structural differentiation, and the other type of response to change, that is when I say a type of response to change, I refer to the capacity of institutions to observe continually changing problems and demand that stresses the capacity of institutions to adapt to or control rapid and continuous change. Much of this definitional variety may be traced to the constant search for more inclusive conceptualizations. That is extremely important. Inclusive conceptualizations. Thus, while some associate modernization with industrialization or economic development, emphasis on individuals increasing control over their natural and social environment, absolute transformation of all aspects of human existence ranging from individual personality to international relations, there is however one distinction which can be made between usages of the term modernization that is of particular importance, because it establishes a basis from which the following critique of modernization theory can proceed. Most conceptualizations of modernization fall into one of two categories. They are either critical variable theories, critical variable approaches or theories, in the sense that they equate modernization with a single type of change. Okay. Or they are dichotomous approaches or dichotomous theories, in that modernization is defined in such a manner that it will serve to conceptualize the process whereby traditional societies acquire the attributes of modernity. The approaches of Squarge and Levy, if you slightly recall that we have discussed just now, represent two instances of critical variable approaches. If you look at critical variable approaches, both Levy and Benjamin Squarge, okay, they come under this. How? When I say the approaches of Levy and Squarge, they represent two instances of critical variable approaches. For Levy, if you or for Squarge, if you look at for Squarge, modernization may be taken as a synonym for the process of rationalization, okay, while in the case of Levy it is defined in terms of two technological indicators of industrialization. Okay. I mean relatively modernized and relatively, what are the two technological indicators of industrialization? I mean relatively modernized societies on the one hand and relatively non-modernized societies on the other. Okay. Another example of critical variable approach to the conceptualization of modernization comes from Wilbert Moore, who is somewhat more straightforward in this respect than Levy, arguing that for most purposes modernization may be equated with industrialization. Okay. He then proceeds to discuss, I mean when he emphasized more on industrialization, he wants to discuss in terms of the conditions, concomitants and consequences. As these examples illustrate, the distinguished trait of critical variable theories is that the term modernization may be freely substituted either for or by some other single term. Perhaps it is because of this trait that the critical variable method of conceptualizing modernization has not been widely adopted by the theorists of or the proponents of modernization theory. Okay. If you look at critical variable theories, we are sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, economists, philosophers, they are not much worried about this, precisely because it always tries to equate modernization with a single type of change. And we all know from the very beginning that a single type of change may not be adequate to capture a particular phenomenon or a particular event. Okay. Most modernization theorists have opted instead for the second method, choosing to set their definitions within the larger conceptual framework provided by the dichotomous approach. Okay. That is why anthropologists, sociologists, social anthropologists, philosophers, political scientists and so on, we all tried to look at dichotomous approaches and how ethnocentric it has been, we will see. Nowhere is the influence of 19th century evolutionary theory more evident than here. Though the device of ideal typical contrasts between the attributes of tradition and modernity, modernization theorists, if you look at this, modernization theorists have done little more than to summarize with the assistance of Parsonian pattern variables and some ethnographic updating. That's why they are more interested in the dichotomous approaches. But if you look at the critical variable approaches, which are examined first not only because it is less frequently adopted, but also because it may be criticized in relatively brief and straightforward terms. It avoids many of the difficulties of the dichotomous approach by conceptualizing modernization as an open-ended rather than goal-directed process, and by defining it in terms which are relatively narrow and concrete, thus giving the concept a greater operational clarity. Critical variable approaches suffer from deficiencies of their own, precisely because they look at only a single variable, maybe industrialization, maybe machines and so on, already identified by its own unique term. The term modernization functions not as a theoretical term, but simply as a synonym. Okay? But I mean, if you look at this, we are more concerned about the dichotomous approaches, as we have mentioned, that though the device of ideal typical contrasts between the attributes of tradition and modernity, modernization theorists have done little more than to summarize with the assistance of Parsonian pattern variables and some ethnographic updating the earlier efforts by scholars like mine, Ferdinand Tönnies, Emil Durkheim and others in the evolutionary tradition to conceptualize the transformation of societies in terms of a transition between polar types of status contract, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft variety. Gemeinschaft means in French, it means community. Gesellschaft in French, it means association. Community is rural based, whereas association is urban based. Community is tradition bound, association is modernity bound. Okay? Modernization in this sense becomes a transition, or rather a series of transitions from primitive subsistence economies to technology intensive industrialized economies, from subject to participant political cultures, from closed ascriptive status systems to open achievement oriented systems, from extended to nuclear kinship units, and from religious to secular ideologies and so on. Thus conceived, modernization is not simply a process of change, but one which is defined in terms of the goals toward which it is moving. Okay? This is extremely important. When I say Weber's rationalization, because modernization, the way has been conceived of, you will find that it is based on Weberian rationalization through Parsonian pattern variables. Okay? That is why when I do this, I mean Weber's analysis of modern capitalism, referring to a variety of related processes by which every aspect of human action became subject to calculation, measurement and control. For Weber, rationalization involves in economic organization, I mean the organization of the factory by bureaucratic means and the calculation of profit by systematic accounting procedures. In religion, the development of theology by an intellectual stratum, the disappearance of magic and the replacement of sacraments by personal responsibility. In law, the erosion of ad hoc lawmaking and arbitrary case law by by deductive legal reasoning on the basis of universal laws. In politics, the decline of traditional norms of legitimacy and the replacement of charismatic leadership or authority by the party machine. In moral behavior, a greater emphasis on discipline and training, discipline and training in moral behavior, and in science, the decline of the individual innovator and the development of research teams, coordinated experiments, and state directed science policies. Okay. Rationalization is a part of Weber's view of capitalist society as an iron cage while the individual stripped of religious meaning and moral values. In the context of society as a whole, the spread of bureaucracy, state control and administration. Okay, that is how Weberian rationalization talks about in the fields of economic organization, religion, law, politics, moral behavior, science and society. Okay. This is extremely important. Okay. That is why when we discussed critical variable approaches, the contrasting strategies of the critical variable approaches on the one hand and dichotomous approaches on the other, to the conceptualization of modernization invites somewhat different criticisms. Okay. That is why you will find the critical variable approaches, as I said, must be examined first, not only because it is less frequently adopted, but also because it may be criticized in relatively brief and straightforward terms. The dichotomous approach, on the other hand, because of the complexity of the issues it raises and because it is more representative of the mainstream thinking about modernization, will require a lengthier and more involved discussion. The critical variable approach, though infrequently resorted to, is not without its advantages. It avoids many of the difficulties of the dichotomous approach by conceptualizing modernization as an open-ended rather than goal-directed process, and by defining it in terms which are relatively narrow and concrete, thus giving the concept greater operational clarity. Unfortunately, however, the critical variable approach suffers from deficiencies of its own. When defined in relation to a single variable which is already identified by its own unique term, the term modernization functions not as a theoretical term, but simply as a synonym. To equate modernization with industrialization, for example, or with indicators typically associated with industrialization, adds nothing to the utility of the concept of industrialization and renders the process of modernization redundant. The only effect of such terminological sleight of hand is to superimpose, and at the cost of a considerable loss in precision, a term that is modernization heavily laden with conventional meanings on an otherwise relatively unambiguous concept. Once decoded, of course, research conducted under the rubric of modernization thus conceived may be of considerable merit, but the rubric itself which necessitates such decoding is superfluous and can only detract from that merit. In short, when modernization is employed as a synonym for some already relatively well defined variable, it performs no useful function and as a consequence should be abandoned. Thus, in so far as critical variable theories are concerned, the second radical option must be exercised concerning the future aspects of modernization theory. Okay? The second option, the modernization theory may be rejected in its entirety. Okay? That is how we are coming to the dichotomous approach. Conceptualizations of modernization incorporating some version of the tradition modernity contrast, civilized barbaric contrast, are less easily dismissed. In order to assess fully the implications of the criticisms which may be directed at theories of this sort, it is helpful to distinguish between three levels of criticism. First, the ideological critique, the empirical critique, and the methodological or meta-theoretical critique. If you look at dichotomous approaches provided the modernization theorist a cognitive map consisting of familiar stable categories derived from their immediate experiences as citizens of a modern society, and then data are derived from relatively non-modernized societies which could be gathered, sorted and interpreted. That is why I said that is why I bank on DC Tips classification of the critique of modernization theory, critique of the dichotomous approaches to modernization theory at three levels. I mean, the first level is the ideological critique, the second empirical, and the third methodological or meta-theoretical critique. Let us first come to the ideological critique. Dichotomous approaches are the one of the most frequently heard complaints against modernization theories in the dichotomous tradition is that they are the product of an essentially ethnocentric worldview. Okay. What is then ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism, this term ethnocentrism was coined by Sumner in Folkways in 1906 to describe prejudicial attitudes between in groups, I mean primary groups, and out groups, I mean secondary groups. In groups means our groups, out groups means their groups, okay, by which our attitudes, customs and behavior are unquestionably and uncritically treated as superior to their social arrangements. Okay. Thereby, the modernization theory, which is based on an ethnocentric worldview, okay, has created binaries, has created dichotomies between tradition and modernity, between civilized and barbarism, and such dichotomous line of thought, such thought of constructing binaries is based on nothing but racism of the biological school of evolutionary theory. Okay. That is why it is important that as modernization theorists began to adapt for their own purposes the dichotomous approach as it was developed by social evolutionists during the late 19th century, they felt constrained to make certain changes. Not only were blatantly ethnocentric terms as civilized and barbarism clearly unacceptable, but the explicit racism of the biological school of evolutionary theory had to be laid to rest. However, such changes were in many respects merely cosmetic. Though the language was changed and racial theories were discarded, modernization theorists have continued to be motivated by what Majrui has termed the self-confidence of ethnocentric achievement. Thus, though the terminology of contemporary modernization theory has been cleaned up, some to give a more neutral impression, it speaks of modernity rather than civilization, tradition rather than barbarism. It continues to evaluate the progress of nations like its 19th century forebears by their proximity to the institutions and values of Western and particularly Anglo-American societies. Okay. The assumption upon which much of modernization theory is based is that, in the words of Sills, modern means, what is the meaning of modern? Modern means being Western without the onus of dependence on the West. Okay. This is extremely important. By deriving the attributes of modernity from a generalized image of Western society and then positing the acquisition of these attributes as the criterion of modernization, modernization theorists have attempted to force the analysis of non-Western societies into what Bendix has termed the Procrustes bed of the European experience. This attempt by modernization theorists to universalize historically specific values and institutions deriving from Western societies may be understood in part at least as a means by which fledgling students of the underdeveloped areas could resolve the cognitive crisis they confronted as they turned their attention during the 1950s, 60s and 70s to the task of attempting to comprehend the course of events in societies whose history, culture and social organization appeared alien and unfamiliar. The dichotomous approach as it gradually took shape in the tradition modernity contrast was admirably suited to fill this intellectual vacuum. It provided the modernization theorist a cognitive map consisting of familiar stable categories derived from their immediate experience as citizens of modern society, according to which data derived from relatively non-modernized societies could be gathered, sorted and interpreted. Moreover, this map not only provided a set of categories for ordering the present of these societies, but by depicting modernization as an inexorable process of change in the direction of modernity. It provided a glimpse of their future as well, a glimpse made all the more comforting to the West by the assurance that it gave that these societies would follow along its own familiar path to modernity. Nevertheless, the specific character of this perspective was shaped not only by the cognitive disorientation of modernization theorists as they explored their new subject matter, but also by their ideological commitments and presuppositions. As the dichotomous tradition was taking shape during the initial period of industrialization in Europe in the 19th century, the ambivalence of many Western intellectuals towards industrialism was reflected in a nostalgic sense of paradise lost that pervaded many characterizations of the traditional past, leading to romantic visions of a society in which, though materially poor and uneducated, people led simple, contented lives so in harmony with nature and bound by strong affective ties into an intensive cohesive communal existence. Although this view of tradition has continued to be of some influence, as is illustrated by the persistent tendency to dramatize the supposedly traumatic impact of modernization on the individual as it wrenches from their idyllic traditional setting, modernization theorists generally speaking have been animated by their considerations. By the mid 20th century, the ambivalence towards industrialism, which in many instances had tempered the earlier versions of the tradition modernity contrast, had dissipated. Thus, contemporary versions of the contrast have been influenced less by a nostalgic view of tradition than by the self-confident optimism of modernization theorists, to whom modernity represented the very embodiment of virtue and progress, and tradition merely a barrier to its realization. And characterizations of modernity in this vein have tended to be no less selective and romantic than earlier characterizations of tradition. Combining strains of rationalism, progressivism and libertarianism, statements such as this sound more like liberal utopias than analytical constructs. Nowhere is found that ambivalence towards modern industrial society which characterized the writing of men such as Marx, Weber and Durkheim, and both the values and cognitions embodied in modernization theory have been highly reflexive of the social and historical conditions under which they have developed. They have social and historical conditions under which they have been developed. The idea of modernization is primarily an American idea developed by American social scientists in the period after the Second World War and reaching the height of its popularity in the middle years of the 1960s. Two features of this period stand out: a widespread attitude of complacency towards American society and the expansion of American political, military and economic interests throughout the world. American society tended to be viewed as fundamentally consensual, combining an unmatched economic prosperity and political stability within a democratic framework. Such social problems as might exist, moreover, were treated not as endemic but rather as aberrations which could be resolved by normal political processes within existing institutions. After 2 decades of turmoil, the post-war tranquility of prosperity and stability seemed no mean accomplishment. The future of modern society now seemed assured, and only that of the developing areas appeared problematic. Such an atmosphere of complacency and self-satisfaction could only encourage the assumption among social scientists that modernity was indeed an unmixed blessing, and that the institutions and values of American society, at least as they existed in their more idealized manifestations, represented an appropriate model to be emulated by other less fortunate societies. It is important to remember, however, that these attitudes themselves were occasioned only by a new concern with the role of the United States in the international sphere. While the imperial societies of Western Europe were confronted with reconstruction at home and decolonization abroad, the US emerged from the Second World War at the height of its industrial and military strength. It also emerged from the war with a peculiar conception of world politics as a struggle between good and evil. If Hitler was the embodiment of evil during the war, then Stalin and Mao became its embodiment in the post-war era. Spurred by this belief, by the encouragement of the European allies and by expanding economic interests abroad, the US assumed leadership of the forces of freedom, involving itself not only in the international but also the domestic affairs scores of nations in its effort to save the world. Okay? And then you will find the ethnocentric, such ethnocentric tendencies should abound in this context is hardly surprising, especially if it is remembered that similar developmental theories were also popular during earlier expansionist periods in both English and American social history. Okay? Essential as is the ideological critique to an understanding of the nature of modernization theory, nevertheless, it constitutes only the introduction to a critical evaluation of the utility of modernization theory. A critique limited to an analysis of the ideological elements which have entered into modernization theory cannot in itself provide an adequate basis for determining whether the notion of modernization merits further consideration or should be rejected in its entirety. There is in principle no reason to assume that the notion of modernization itself is inherently incompatible with a variety of ethnocentrisms, or that a revolutionary or socialist version of modernization theory could not be developed. That much of contemporary contemporary modernization theory has been Western centered, reformist and bourgeois does not preclude the possibility of alternative formulations. Even if one were to suggest that the idea of modernization should be dropped entirely because of the distortions these commitments introduce, whatever approach is substituted would be no less subject to these or other ideological distortions. The ideological critique of modernization theory is addressed to the motivations, cognitions and purposes which gave it birth. It does not speak directly to the truth content of the theory. While selective and distorted cognitions born of partisan commitments may be presumed to result in a disproportionate number of assertions which upon examination turn out to be false, incomplete or misleading. This can be established in each case only by an appeal to the available evidence. Analysis of the ideological basis of modernization theory can help us explain and predict its empirical shortcomings, but cannot confirm them. Thus, the ideological critique must be supplemented by other critical perspectives, and this brings us to the second level of criticism, that is the empirical critique. Although this category has the appearance of something of a catch-all. The criticism subsumed within it to do share some important common ground in that each draws attention to some empirical inadequacy of modernization theory, okay, in the form of either an erroneous or misleading empirical assertion that has incorporated into its conceptual framework, or of a critical range of phenomena which it has overlooked. Since the bulk of criticisms which have been directed against modernization theory have been formulated primarily at this level, the main points of the empirical critique are already fairly well developed and can be summarized very briefly. Let us do it this way. Theories of modernization have been criticized for viewing the transformation of societies as largely the result of immanent processes of change. It is criticized for viewing the transformation of societies, I mean, when I said as largely the result of immanent processes of change, and viewed in this context of I mean the origins and ideological components of modernization theory, such criticism is not entirely unexpected. By focusing largely upon variables relating to indigenous aspects of social structure and culture, modernization theorists have either underestimated or ignored many important external sources of or influences upon social change. Even modernization theorists who emphasize the role of the Western impact in modernization tend to look at this impact only in terms of its consequences for the diffusion of the particular cultural attributes, ignoring the structural mechanisms of the interactions between societies. Okay? That is why it is extremely important to look at Clifford Geer's the interpretation of cultures. When we do this, the limitations of this perspective are particularly evident when applied to the new states of Asia and Africa, whose emergence did so much to stimulate the development of modernization theory. Okay? Any theoretical framework which fails to incorporate such significant variables as the impact of war, conquest, colonial domination, international political and military relationships, international trade and cross national flow of capital cannot hope to explain either the origins of these societies or the nature of their struggles for political and economic autonomy, struggles, it should be added, which all societies face, though perhaps in varying degrees and contexts at different historical trajectories. Okay? That is why it is extremely important to understand, I mean, the problems in the notion of traditional society and so on. Other difficulties are raised by the notion of traditional society, as Huntington has recently noted. Modernity and tradition are essentially asymmetrical concepts. The modern idea is set forth and then everything which is not modern is labeled traditional. Okay? Thus, the notion of tradition was formulated not upon the basis of observation, but rather as hypothetical antithesis to modernity. This fact is reflected in a number of the empirical limitations of the concept of modernization. For example, the conventional stereotype that traditional societies are essentially static from the perspective of the tradition modernity contrast. History begins with the transition from traditional to modern society. Since this transition is generally assumed to have begun in non-Western areas as a result of contact with Western European societies, this amounts to an implicit denial of the relevance of the pre-contact experience of these areas to their subsequent development. As knowledge of pre-contact history has increased, however, such a static image of traditional societies has proven untenable. In fact, traditional societies appeared changeless only because they were defined in a manner that allowed no differences between traditions and recognized no significant change save that in the direction of the Western experience. Since the tradition modernity contrast focuses only upon the presumed similarities of traditional societies. Moreover, it fails to allow for a multiplicity of traditions in a spatial as well as temporal sense. Thus, social structures of the most diverse sort are thrown together in the same category, sharing little more than the label traditional and the fact that they are not modern industrial societies. By thus ignoring the diversity of traditional societies, the dichotomous approach ignores those differences between societies which contribute to the determination of the specific character of their development, as we have discussed in the works of Levy. Classic contrast between the alternative courses of economic change in China and Japan. Moreover, this diversity may be found within as well as between traditional societies. Clifford Geertz, for example, comments that the integrative revolution, that a simple, coherent, broadly defined ethnic structure such as is found in most industrial societies is not an undissolved residue of traditionalism, but an earmark of modernity. While Geertz perhaps exaggerates the homogeneity of industrial societies, his basic point is a sound one. Many traditional societies are not highly integrated, socially and culturally homogeneous communities, but rather tend to encompass multiple traditions. Even so, even to apply the adjectives traditional or modern, okay, to the same noun society is misleading, since it obscures the transformation of traditional social and political units into national societies maintained by a territorial state. Indeed, the internal diversity of traditions is often compounded in the course of this transformation, as a number of such traditional units are consolidated into a single national society. The colonial experiences of the new states pose an additional problem, since the superimposition by conquest of one tradition, albeit a modern one, upon one or more traditions produces a hybrid society. It is neither traditional nor modern, as these terms are usually employed by modernization theorists. These experiences can be assimilated to the dichotomous tradition modernity contrast only with great difficulty, either by treating colonialism as an instrument of modernization, an argument which often has been asserted in order to legitimize colonial domination, or as a transitional phase between tradition and modernity. Neither solution is adequate. Like tradition, colonialism may be conducive to modernization in some contexts, but in others it may constitute a barrier. Neither can the effects of colonial domination be dismissed as transitional, since their scope and duration are often just as significant as is that of pre-colonial conditions, particularly in those instances where colonialism endured for a number of generations. If you look at another set of criticisms which has been directed against the notion of tradition and modernity, represent two mutually exclusive and functionally interdependent clusters of attributes. When I said, I mean this notion may be broken down into two constituent adjacents. First, the attributes of tradition and modernity are mutually exclusive, and second, the attributes of each are functionally interdependent. Several critics of the first one, I mean mutually exclusive clusters, have pointed to the persistence of many traditional values and institutions in supposedly modern industrial societies, and to the importance of these institutions in the shaping of the development of the societies. I mean, in both modern and modernizing societies, the dynamics of modernization have consisted not in the substitution of one set of attributes for another, that is of modernity or for tradition, but rather in their mutual interpretation and transformation. And imperialism of categories and historical possibilities by artificially constructing an analytic gap which denies the possibility of innovation, mutual adaptation and synthesis. Once these possibilities are acknowledged, modernization can no longer be equated simply with the destruction of tradition, for industrialization or the tradition is not a, or industrialization is not a prerequisite of modernization, since in many instances traditional institutions and values may facilitate rather than impede the social changes usually associated with modernization. Nor is it in itself a sufficient condition of modernization, since the destruction of tradition, as for example by colonial domination, may lead in directions other than modernity. When I come to functionally interdependent clusters of attributes, okay, this generally critics of the first assertion, mutually interdependent, have always been critical of this functionally interdependent clusters of attributes. For once it is considered that modernity and tradition are not mutually exclusive, then the notion that each constitutes a closed functionally interdependent system of attributes is also open to question. Specifically, three implications of this notion have been attacked. The first is that those particular functional interdependencies observed in the transformation of Western societies will be recapitulated elsewhere, a notion which strongly implies moreover acceptance of the convergence thesis that as modernization proceeds, societies will become increasingly alike in their essential characteristics. Against these ideas, it has been argued that because of differences in their starting points, that is in their traditional institutions and values and in the timing of their transformations, many of the institutional configurations which characterized the modernization of Western societies are unlikely to be duplicated in the subsequent modernization of other societies. And at the level of technology, there is no need to recapitulate the stages of technological development in the advanced societies, since the latest technologies lie in modern societies, and the availability of a variety of models of modernity create conditions which, when combined with the unique heritage of each society, make the reproduction of Western institutional patterns in the modernization process most unlikely. To ignore differences such as these is in the setting of modernization is to risk an undue generalization of the particularities of the Western experience and to overlook diversity in search of for convergence. The last two implications derived from the assertion of the systemic character of modernization are closely related. They hold that the attributes of modernity form a package, thus tending to appear as a cluster rather than in isolation. And consequently, that modernization in one sphere will necessarily produce compatible changes in other spheres. Okay. Critics of these assertions have argued that, on the contrary, the attributes of modernity do not necessarily appear as a package, rather its attributes may be unbundled, absorbed selectively. Such piecemeal modernization need not lead to modernity. Modern medicine, the transistor radio and a modern military establishment are all instances of modernization in the sense that each represents a case of the acquisition of a trait or set of traits associated with modernity. But whether or not such modernization implies eventual acquisition of the entire package of modernity is problematic. Indeed, the introduction of modern medicine may only compound poverty by increasing population pressures. The transistor radio may be employed merely to reinforce traditional values, and a technologically sophisticated military may be placed in the service of the most reactionary regimes. Thus, such selective modernization may only strengthen traditional institutions and values, and rapid social change in one sphere may serve only to inhibit change in others. Okay. Then we'll come to the methodological or meta-theoretical critique. You will find when I say the methodological or meta-theoretical critique, I mean in the sense that it focuses upon the underlying strategy of conceptualization involved in modernization theory and its usefulness, and it also focuses directly upon the central issue raised by the choice between the revisionist and radical alternatives. In spite of its importance, however, this level of criticism has been less thoroughly explored than the previous two. In the definition of any concept, if you find in the definition of any concept or a set of concepts, there is a perennial tension between the logical requirements of comparability and those of explanation. Okay. If you look at this, the first straining in the direction of when I say comparability and explanation, you will find in this first one straining in the direction of increasing generality in order to extend the range of the concept of modernization's applicability to larger number of cases, and when I say explanation in the opposite direction of an increasing specificity which enhances its powers of discrimination. And the proponents of modernization theory have chosen to resolve this tension in the direction of comparability, not in the direction of explanation. And in this sense, logical requirements of explanation have provided the crux of the Latin American as well as Marxist theory critiques of modernization paradigm. If this is so, especially Latin American critique of modernization theory, I mean development of underdevelopment through the works of Andre Gunder Frank and others, that has led to, I mean that has emerged as a convergence between two intellectual strands, namely neo-Marxism on the one hand and the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America on the other, Eckler tradition on the other, that we are going to cover in the 8th week, in the next week. Then what we have discussed today, we have discussed the critiques of modernization theory in terms of a threefold debate, namely the ideological critique 1, the empirical critique 2, and the methodological or meta-theoretical critique 3. Okay? And then we are going to discuss in the next week dependency theory and its critiques and so on in the weeks to follow. Thank you.